All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Katie Conchar. I'm a restoration practitioner with the Nature Conservancy Gulf Program and coordinator for the Florida Oyster Recovery Science Community of Practice. So welcome to today's call. Today we have Devin Resko with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission Division of Marine Fisheries, who's joined us to talk about FWC's proposed rules to the FWC Commission for statewide oyster management. And my understanding is those go forward to the commission this coming fall, I believe in August. So welcome to Devin. Just a brief background. FWC closed the Apalachicola Bay oyster fishery in 2020, and they designated an expiration date for that closure or sunset that would reopen the fishery on January 1st of 2026, so next year. In preparation for that closure to sunset, FWC does plan to recommend proposed rules for oyster harvest in Apalachicola Bay as well as statewide for commission consideration. And so Devin's here with us today to provide an overview of FWC's efforts in engaging stakeholders and in developing updates on the management and regulation of the fishery. Before we get started, Megan, I see you've got your hand raised. Do you have a question, comment?
No, that was a mistake. Sorry.
No worries. Glad you're with us. All right, Devin, I'll turn it over to you. And if folks have questions, I think we can type those in the chat and I'll try to monitor that, Devin. If you would like folks to hold those until the end, we'll also have some time for a Q&A.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds good. I'm going to, so screen is shared. I'm going to turn off camera just for bandwidth purposes, but I will still be here. But yeah, that sounds good. I have just a quick presentation. Like Katie mentioned, the presentation will provide an overview of FWC's efforts in developing updates to the management and regulation pertaining to both reopening of the Apalachicola Bay oyster fishery, as well as changes that could affect oyster fisheries statewide here in Florida. And for those who don't know, I'm with FWC's Division of Marine Fisheries Management within the analysis and rulemaking section. I'm listed as a biological administrator, and my focus, I guess for the past few years, has primarily been Apalachicola Bay and the Big Bend region. But since November, it has expanded to statewide. So like Katie mentioned, we do have quite a bit coming up, bringing items to the FWC Commission meetings, which I'll be discussing in this presentation. So definitely busy, but we've got a lot of work that we have done, and I'm really excited to share that with you guys. So this is a more detailed outline for today's presentation. I'll provide some overarching ideas regarding the background on why potential revisions to oyster fishery management is necessary and what FWC aims to achieve. Then I'll discuss the importance of oysters, status of oysters here in the state, including focusing in on details pertaining to Apalachicola Bay. I'll then provide a summary of what FWC has learned from our first round of public workshops on oysters that occurred through April and early May, and then discuss the potential management framework for reopening Apalachicola Bay, as well as some potential changes for statewide regulations. And finally, I'll wrap up the presentation discussing overarching considerations that summarize all of these potential proposed points. So the main theme of this presentation today is FWC's work and efforts in developing a management framework for oysters in the Apalachicola Bay and statewide. And this is because the reality is that some of the current oyster regulations in place no longer reflect the current state of the resource. Florida has experienced a dramatic decline in oyster reefs, including in Apalachicola Bay. And the 2013 collapse of oysters in Apalachicola Bay resulted in a closure, as Katie mentioned, scheduled to end in 2026 by sunset. FWC staff have developed potential changes and discussed these changes with stakeholders and will continue to do that this summer and early fall. And FWC staff are scheduled to bring recommendations for proposed rules for Apalachicola Bay and statewide measures to the August 2025 FWC Commission meeting in Havana. So FWC has the goal to restart the local oyster fishery in Apalachicola Bay in a sustainable manner that does not harm the continued recovery of the bay's oysters. To achieve this goal, only oyster reefs that meet an ecological threshold would be opened for commercial harvest. Harvest levels would be conservative to support long-term continued success of the fishery. Additionally, FWC would aim to reintroduce a culching program to replenish harvested reefs. In addition to the culching of harvested reefs, continued restoration efforts would be important to support the recovery of the historically depleted oyster reefs in the bay. These restoration initiatives would enhance the ecosystem services oysters provide to the local area and also provide more fishery resources and opportunities. In order for these goals and objectives to be met, continued and increased funding will be necessary. Long-term commitment to sustainable fishery management and restoration efforts will be key to continued rebuilding of the oyster fishery in Apalachicola Bay. So a little bit of background. These items will be not very new to folks here today, but more on the why we're doing this. Oysters are valuable to their environment and to the people that live near them, and due to the variety of benefits that oysters deliver, they have been termed the coral reefs of the estuary. Key benefits oysters provide include improving water quality by filtering algae and other nutrients from the water, protecting shorelines by acting as a natural barrier to reduce wave energy, storm surge, and erosion. Oysters are an economically and culturally important fishery resource. And oysters also play an important role in their environment as habitat creators, providing habitat for numerous important species, including redfish and spotted sea trout. Really, all of these points highlight the importance that oysters have to their local ecosystem. But oysters face multiple threats that have collectively contributed to the decline of Florida's oyster reefs. The threats outlined here on this slide have negatively impacted Florida's oysters to varying degrees. Oyster reef loss has been primarily a result of harvest, but it's historically also been due to construction. So, for example, using shells to pave roadways. But recently, reef loss has been exacerbated due to the transition from a shucking fishery to a half-shell fishery. And that's because in the half-shell market, oysters are shipped whole to retailers and restaurants, so that shell is rarely returned to the site of harvest. This image here from the Big Bend region shows the stark difference in oyster habitat between the raised, healthy part of the reef and the poor quality, low-lying reef area in the front, where there's a lot of loose shell material that does not provide suitable habitat for continued oyster recruitment. Other threats include oyster diseases that can negatively impact oyster health, reproduction, and survival, changes in water quality, natural predators such as oyster drills and boring sponges, as well as competition with increasing and northward migrating mangrove presence. All of these threats listed here, some of them even working in tandem, have had profound negative impacts on Florida oyster reefs. And unfortunately, this important resource has seen these severe declines on a global scale. This map here illustrates the poor conditions of many oyster systems worldwide. This research shows that 85% of the world's oyster reefs have been lost as of 2008. And the Gulf was considered one of the last remaining areas in the world for which oyster conservation and sustainable wild fisheries were feasible. But in a 2023 meeting among U.S. Gulf states, all 5 spoke of severely depleted oyster resources. And this is despite implementing increased regulations and conducting restoration. Focusing here in Florida, many estuaries have lost 80 to 90% of their oyster reefs. All Florida oyster reefs that were once dense and thriving are now considered patchy due to these significant declines. This image here demonstrates how Florida's wild oyster harvest, commercial fishery harvest has fluctuated from the mid-1990s through 2012, and really how these fluctuations were met with a sharp decline in 2013 due to the collapse of oysters in Apalachicola Bay. This figure also demonstrates the dominance Apalachicola Bay has had on the state's oyster fishery. Dating back to 1995, oyster harvest in Florida was primarily done in Franklin and Wakulla counties in the Panhandle, but also Levy County in the Big Bend and St. Johns County in the northeast part of the state. Levy County in the Big Bend surpassed Franklin County in years leading up to the 2020 closure of Apalachicola Bay. And since that 2020 closure, harvest hotspots are Levy and Dixie County in the Big Bend, as well as St. Johns County in Northeast Florida. But again, historically, looking back through 1995, even these current levels are really dwarfed by the amount of oyster landings that were coming out of Apalachicola Bay over the past few decades. So focusing in on Apalachicola Bay, in Apalachicola, the local oyster fishery, again, has historically dominated commercial oyster harvest in Florida, as well as represented a significant component of commercial oyster production on the national scale. 90% of the state's commercial landings and 10% of commercially harvested wild oysters that were sold in the U.S. used to come from Apalachicola Bay. Apalachicola oysters are an iconic name brand fishery on par with Maine lobster and Maryland blue crab. The fishery defined the Apalachicola community both culturally and economically by employing over 2,500 individuals in a rural region of the state. Oyster harvest from the bay routinely fluctuated between periods of highs and lows. The fishery was severely impacted by Hurricane Elena in 1985. However, it quickly began recovering in the late 1980s. But landings later collapsed again in 2013. But unlike the 1980s response to Hurricane Elena, there has been no significant recovery in the following years of that 2013 collapse. Starting in 2013, FWC issued 20 executive orders to reduce harvest pressure in Apalachicola Bay in response to the collapse. Through executive orders and then rule change, FWC implemented a closure in 2020 to provide the oyster reefs with time to recover from the continued low abundance. During this time, FWC began a restoration efforts with funds provided by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and later by the governor and legislature. This figure here of commercial oyster harvest in Apalachicola Bay really illustrates many of the points discussed on the previous slide. Oyster landings from the bay routinely fluctuated between periods of good and better years of harvest until a drastic decline from Hurricane Elena, which is about in the middle of this figure. Almost immediately after Hurricane Elena, the fishery began rebounding. However, it never again reached the same peaks as earlier decades, and instead a new lower cycle emerged. The best periods after the 1980s are more similar to the lower periods prior to the 1980s. And again, in 2013, landings later collapsed, and there has been no significant rebound or recovery observed since the 2013 collapse. FWC monitors oysters in Apalachicola Bay, including density on particular reefs. This map here shows the monitoring efforts that were done in 2025, this year. The dark red area that is kind of sprinkled throughout this image represents suitable oyster habitat present in the bay, which totals about 500 acres. This would be a 95% decline from the estimated 10,000 acres of suitable habitat that once existed. The points on the map represent what we found during the 2025 monitoring performed by FWC, and the legend is based on the FDAC Standard Oyster Resource Management Protocol. So the green dots represent oyster densities that FDAC's protocol suggests could allow sustainable harvest. So that is more than 400 bags of legal-sized oysters per acre. The red X's represent oyster densities that the protocol suggests could not allow sustainable harvest. And additionally, the black stars that are kind of sprinkled throughout this image refer to areas where FWC monitoring found no legal oysters were present. And looking at this figure, it's an overview of Florida's oyster regulations currently in place, as well as regulations that were in place at the time of the closure that were particular to Apalachicola Bay. To accommodate year-round oyster harvesting in Apalachicola, portions of the bay were seasonally rotated, which allowed certain areas to only be open during a summer or winter harvest season. These areas were termed summer bars and winter bars. In Apalachicola Bay, regular monitoring of the oyster bars were done to assess oyster populations, and if monitoring showed that adult populations had declined below 300 bags per acre, harvest was prohibited from Friday through Sunday. For commercial harvest statewide in Florida, a valid saltwater products license, or SPL, is needed, as well as a shellfish endorsement obtained through FDACS. For harvesting in Apalachicola Bay, however, an Apalachicola Bay oyster harvesting license was required, and having that Apalachicola license exempted those harvesters from needing a shellfish endorsement when harvesting in Apalachicola. For recreational harvest in Florida, a saltwater fishing license is required. The current bag limit is 20 bags per day for commercial harvest and 2 bags per day for recreational harvest. And for Apalachicola Bay, the bag limit was modified multiple times leading up to the closure, with a limit of 2 bags for commercial and 5 gallons for recreational harvest that was in place at the time Apalachicola Bay was closed. Harvest is prohibited from waters that are closed due to seafood consumption safety concerns. And additionally, oysters are to be delivered to certified dealers by certain times, depending on the time of the year. FDACS is responsible for assessing and closing harvest areas and the time temperature matrix for delivery of harvested oysters to certified dealers. So FWC has been soliciting public opinions and ideas about what reopening Apalachicola Bay should look like, as well as statewide changes. This included holding public workshops in April, May, and June of this year. FWC held 7 public workshops around the state, 2 in Apalachicola, 1 in Pensacola, 1 in Cedar Key, and 1 in St. Augustine, as well as 2 virtual workshops. Though we did run into unforeseen technical issues during the question portion of the workshop that was done on June 5th, preventing attendees from interacting with FWC. And because of those issues, we have rescheduled that workshop to basically give it again to provide that opportunity to people in attendance. And that workshop will be on June 26th. Katie, I'll make sure to keep you in the loop and let you know when we do have those notifications going out, including the links to go into the meeting to where you can certainly distribute it to people here today. These workshops allowed FWC to provide updates on the current state of oysters in Florida and our efforts in research and monitoring, restoration, and assessments of management and regulation of the fishery. Workshops also allowed stakeholders to ask FWC staff questions, as well as provide public comment. Additionally, at the in-person workshops, FWC utilized clickers to gather stakeholder feedback on a variety of questions. We feel that using the clickers for a questionnaire allows us to gather a lot of feedback quickly and discreetly. And I mentioned getting data discreetly because some of the local oyster fisheries can be a close-knit society where one person may not feel comfortable providing their public comment if it goes against the tide of the majority of those in attendance. So here's an overview of what we've learned so far from some of these workshops. In total, over 180 stakeholders have attended the workshops, including commercial and recreational harvesters, aquaculturists, charter captains, wholesalers, external researchers, elected officials, and concerned citizens. All of those in attendance certainly had diverse backgrounds as well as perspectives. So this is a summary of what we've learned from the April and May workshops as we're still going through data from last week's workshop. A majority of attendees supported the reopening of oyster harvest in Apalachicola Bay in 2026. That being said, there was opposition to reopening due to low abundance of oysters in the bay. For those interested in re-entering the Apalachicola Bay fishery, there was support for keeping the fishery limited, both in terms of participation and overall take. Many other components of the oyster fishery management were mixed. This included whether it's more important to have fewer harvesters in the Apalachicola fishery with greater income potential or more harvesters with less income potential. So think of it as more full-timers or more part-timers. What the percent take of harvest should be set for reefs in Apalachicola, requiring a restricted species endorsement for commercial oyster harvest, limiting recreational harvest by limiting participants, limiting bag limits, limiting overall take, or even closing recreational harvest, decreasing the tolerance for undersized oysters, and allowing the enforcement of oyster regulations at the wholesale dealer. Feedback received from all these workshops on all of these points and other points informed how staff drafted the potential management changes. So I'll now dive into the framework for both Appalach and statewide changes. For Appalach, I'll discuss the threshold to open a reef to harvest, harvest levels, qualifications for participants to enter the fishery, a commercial AB endorsement, the harvest season, bag limits, monitoring of harvest, and culching. For potential changes for statewide regulations, I'll discuss the commercial license requirements, culling and undersize tolerances, and the enforcement of size limits. So the bay as a whole has not recovered from the 2013 collapse. So setting a threshold to open a reef to harvest ensures that harvest is done only on reefs that we think can sustain harvest. This prevents harvest on reefs with low densities of adult oysters to ultimately allow for continued recovery. The proposed threshold to open a reef to harvest would be 400 bags of legal-sized oysters per acre. This is based on the Standard Oyster Resource Management Protocol, which deemed reefs with 400 bags per acre being able to sustain harvest. This threshold would apply to both commercial and recreational harvest. FWC would perform monitoring to evaluate the reefs annually. FWC would announce the reefs that meet this 400 bags per acre threshold and that would be open for harvest prior to the season start. Based on the 2025 FWC monitoring results, there are 4 reefs that currently meet that threshold. A large restoration site on Cat Point termed Cat Point Nifwif, Cat Point Spur, East Hole, and Peanut Ridge. So to prevent overharvest, FWC intends to limit the total take of oysters from the bay. This reduces the likelihood of overharvest as the ecosystem continues to recover. Additionally, a conservative amount of harvest increases the chances of oyster reefs being opened the following season, allowing a long-term fishery. FWC is considering setting the harvest level at 5% of legal-sized oysters on reefs open to harvest to establish the annual harvest levels. Limits for each open reef would be set annually and published on FWC's website prior to the season start. This management strategy is similar to approaches by other states, including Alabama and Mississippi. The table here on the slide provides the number of bags that could be harvested with a 5% harvest level from the 4 reefs in Apalachicola Bay that are meeting that 400 bags per legal-sized oyster, 400 bags of legal-sized oysters per acre threshold. In total, almost 2,500 bags would be allowed for harvest. For entry into the Apalachicola Bay oyster fishery, a new Apalachicola Bay endorsement, or AB, would be required. This would professionalize the fishery, promote compliance with regulations, and limit opportunities to Floridians. Potential qualifications for the endorsement include having no fish and wildlife violations within the prior 10 years, having an individual or crew SPL, a bivalve endorsement, and a restricted species endorsement. This would not be open to anyone with a vessel SPL to prevent an endorsement from being held by a corporation, and being a Florida resident. Regarding the restricted species endorsement, or the RS requirement, there would be a one-time exemption for those who had an AP license prior to the bay's closure to obtain an RS. These qualifications would be required to apply for an AB endorsement. So diving deeper into the potential management framework, FWC is proposing two options for issuing the new Apalachicola Bay commercial endorsement. Each option here creates different levels of participation in the fishery. Option 1 limits the number of AB endorsements. Overall, 10 individuals would be randomly selected by lottery to receive an endorsement, though that number could certainly increase in the future. In order to receive an endorsement, you would need to meet all qualifications described on the previous slide and have had previously harvested oysters in Apalachicola Bay from 2016 to 2020. Additionally, you would need to meet a threshold of recorded oyster landings in Apalachicola Bay between that time frame. So one example that I have listed here on that sub-bullet is having a total of 1,000 pounds landed between that time frame. That could be an option, but we are certainly engaging with stakeholders to determine what the correct threshold should be. The annual harvest levels available bags would be equally distributed among the 10 endorsement holders. These endorsement holders would be provided the opportunity to renew annually, but must have harvested oysters in Apalachicola Bay during the previous season. Any unused endorsements and unrenewed endorsements would be returned to FWC and would be reissued from the same lottery process. Switching over to option 2, this would not limit the number of AB endorsements and instead allow all participants who meet qualifications described on the previous slide to receive an endorsement. Applicants would need to apply by the application deadline each year. The annual harvest levels available bags would be equally distributed among the endorsement holders. This figure illustrates the earning potential for commercial harvesters using the 2025 monitoring data. Vertical axis is dockside value, assuming wholesalers will pay $100 per bag. The horizontal axis is the number of harvesters. Recall that between the 4 reefs meeting that threshold, given 2025 monitoring data, there were 2,472 available bags for harvest, so just under 2,500 total available bags. The green line shows that the more harvesters allowed into the fishery, the individual dockside value is less. When only 5 harvesters, for example, are in the fishery, each would look to make about $5,000 worth of dockside value. But when you allow 55 harvesters, that number drops considerably to where each harvester could look to make just under $5,000 in dockside value. So we provided this information to help inform stakeholders when thinking about option 1 versus option 2, because keeping the fishery to only 10 harvesters allows for each of those 10 to make about $25,000 worth of dockside value. But with option 2, where all who apply and meet the qualifications receive an endorsement, the amount each harvester could make would be considerably less. Now let's focus on potential seasons and bag limits for Apalachicola Bay. The potential commercial season would be October 1 through the end of February, and harvest would be allowed all days of the week. There would be no commercial daily bag limit or vessel limit. Endorsement holders would be issued all bag tags at the start of the season. These bag tags would be specific to each individual reef that is open to harvest. The harvesters can then choose when to use their bag tags during the open season. So some good examples on this in the real world may be someone wants to go out immediately and just get all of their bag tags and complete their harvest for the season as soon as it opens up. Perhaps one harvester may want to only harvest during the holidays when maybe the amount they could get from the dealer would be the greatest. So maybe they only harvest around Thanksgiving and around Christmas. Or maybe a harvester has an agreement with a wholesaler that, hey, I will bring in X number of bags every Thursday so you can get them prepped and sold on the weekends. It gives total flexibility to the harvesters to determine within the season when they harvest their bag tags. At this time, no recreational harvest in Appalachia is being recommended. So the potential framework for harvest in 2026 does not include recreational seasons or bag limits. And under this potential management framework, the first commercial season would open October 1, 2026. Monitoring of harvest will be necessary throughout the season to understand and learn from the current season's harvest to adaptively manage the fishery and the resource. One potential method of monitoring harvest would be with a phone app, which would be used by all fishery participants. The app would allow both harvesters and wholesale dealers to check in harvest. The harvester would hail out and hail in on all harvest trips. They would also send a report at the start and end of harvest for each oyster bag. The harvester would upload a photo of the used bag tag once completed. The wholesaler would submit a report on the phone app with photos of the tags when they purchased the oyster bag from an endorsement holder. This app could be used in the future by recreational harvesters. There's also the potential for mandatory landing locations around Apalachicola Bay. So this means that landing of harvested oysters could only be done at certain boat ramps around the bay. No specific locations, though, have been determined. The last element of the potential framework to reopen Appalachia is to restart the Apalachicola Bay Culching Program. This would meet the objective to return material to harvested reefs to promote new growth and support of the goal of a sustainable fishery. When funds are available, FWC would culch harvested reefs after the season closed with a thin layer of culch material. These culch reefs would then be closed to harvest for 1 year after. This would provide time for spat settlement and growth on the new material, enhancing the reef structure and supporting long-term sustainability of the reef and the bay. After the 1 year closure, reefs would still need to meet the 400 bags per acre threshold to be reopened to harvest. So some of the potential framework that would apply to Apalachicola Bay could also apply statewide. And so these are outlined in this slide. Oysters would be added to the restricted species list, meaning that commercial harvesters would need a restricted species endorsement, or RS, to a harvest. There are several ways to qualify for an RS based on income requirements. Additionally, there are multiple qualification exemptions based on age, military status, and more. And as previously mentioned, we are suggesting there be a one-time exemption created for those who had the AP, the Apalachicola Bay license, and prior to the bay's closure to apply for an RS. There are several potential changes related to culling. The tolerances for undersized attached and unattached oysters would be both changed from a percentage to a count and lowered. Tolerances for unattached oysters would be lowered from 5% to 5 oysters, and tolerances for undersized attached oysters would be lowered from 15% to 15 oysters. Additionally, culling of substrate material that is larger than 2 inches would be required to be done at the site of harvest. It is important to cull the substrate on site to preserve the restoration material on the reefs. Enforcement of these size limits of undersized oysters and substrate in oyster bags would be enforceable off the water, including at wholesale facilities. So to wrap up and kind of provide some considerations on these proposed points, what has been discussed in this presentation would restart the local Apalachicola Bay oyster fishery in a sustainable manner that continues to promote recovery of the bay's oysters. The fishery would be adaptively managed so that only oyster reefs that meet an ecological threshold would be opened for commercial harvest, allowing other reefs to continue to recover. Harvest levels on open reefs would be set annually based on monitoring, and a potential reestablishment of a long-term culching program would support the replenishment of harvested reefs. The potential qualification and selection framework of the Apalachicola Bay commercial fishery would foster a professional commercial fishery through regulation compliance and facilitation of enforcement of existing regulations. The potential changes to statewide management would further promote a professional oyster fishery that provides regulations and license requirements focused on the continued health of the resource. Overall, these considerations encourage increased ecosystem services and advocate for a long-term sustainable oyster fishery in Florida. So to quickly recap, these are the items that I went through during this presentation. So for Apalachicola Bay, potential items include setting a threshold of 400 bags per acre to open a reef to harvest, a 5% harvest level on open reefs, qualifications for participants to enter the fishery, including no violations in the past year, having an individual or crew saltwater products license, a restricted species endorsement, and a bivalve endorsement, as well as being a Florida resident. 2 options for the commercial AB endorsement. Option 1, limiting it to 10 participants who have past landings in Apalachicola Bay. And option 2, allowing all those who qualify to apply to get an AB endorsement being allowed into the fishery. The harvest seasons being set from October through February. No daily bag limits on the bags that are allocated to the harvesters. Monitoring of harvest through a phone app. Having specific landing locations in the bay. And culching harvested reefs followed by a 1-year closure on those culched reefs. For potential changes for statewide regulations, items include a commercial license requirements of a restricted species endorsement, reducing the tolerance for undersized attached and unattached oysters, as well as changing the enforcement from a percentage to a count, requiring substrate larger than 2 inches be culled on site, and enforcement of size limits of undersized oysters and substrates off the water, including at the wholesale dealer. Moving forward, staff will take a stepwise approach to review oyster regulations in all of Florida, continue to meet with stakeholders, and bring recommendations for rule changes to the FWC Commission as necessary. The proposed timeline for the Commission to consider rule proposals is staff plan to provide proposed rules on Apalachicola Bay and statewide measures at the FWC Commission meeting later this year in August, followed by a final rule consideration in November of this year. The process will then be done for the Big Bend region in February and May 2026. And additional rule proposals for other systems will be evaluated after Apalachicola Bay and the Big Bend. These areas include Northeast Florida and Pensacola. Funding for ongoing restoration continues to be a priority for FWC. Therefore, we will continue to request funding from the Florida legislature and seek out other funding sources for restoration, as well as to perform FWC-led culching on reefs in Apalachicola Bay. But we'll also continue to advise and support external partners on other restoration efforts. In the current budget, the agency requested $20 million for restoration in Apalachicola Bay for the next fiscal year, and we await to see what the final budget shows. But depending on funding, the next phase of restoration in Apalachicola Bay and the Big Bend are coming in the next few years. Staff will also continue monitoring and research on oysters throughout Florida and continue to engage with external research partners and stakeholders on this important topic. So that concludes my presentation. Thanks everyone for listening. I have my contact information on here, as well as the contact information for my supervisor, Erica Burgess. I've also listed some helpful info on ways to provide comment on all the items that I've presented here today. And again, do want to stress, we will be having another virtual workshop over this information on June 26th. I know Katie put the link in the email notification for this meeting, as well as in the chat now, so I appreciate that. You will not see the Microsoft Teams link to actually enter the workshop until the morning of. But I'll also send out plenty of reminders that will be dispersed pretty widely to make sure that everyone has the necessary information. So in the remaining time, I'm certainly available to help field any questions or comments. I do have Claire McIntyre on the call as well to help with any FWRI related questions. So I will hand the virtual microphone back over to Katie.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you very much for putting that presentation together. There are a few comments or questions in the chat, some of which you may have gotten to, but let's clarify. The first from Vincent is, will or has the state revived its shell repletion program?
Yeah, so that is something that, you know, a lot of different aspects regarding oyster management, whether it be restoration, research, the fishery management itself, there can be a lot of differing opinions on that. But I think one thing that everyone really agrees on is we need to continue to restore reefs, whether that's through large scale restoration of kind of building those reefs back up, or culching reefs with that thin kind of sprinkling of a veneer of material on that. So that's something that is certainly a priority within the agency. It is heavily dependent on funding, and not only that, recurring funding. So we continue to engage with external partners, but we also work internally within our external affairs folks. Can be a jumble of words there, but working with folks downtown in Tallahassee to really tell them that restoration and culching is a priority within the agency. We continue to advocate that through our legislative budget requests through each fiscal year. So right now, a lot of the funding internally has been allocated to Apalachicola Bay. We do have some funding upcoming in the Big Bend region as well. So we want to continue to expand geographically out of those areas to continue restoration and shell replenishment throughout the state. Right now, a lot of the effort has been on working with those external partners, but I do want to say that it is internally still a priority within the agency. We will continue to request funding for those actions.
Okay, I have a few follow-ups to that. Devin, although Vincent, I see you've come off mute. Do you have a question or follow-up to that one?
Oh, a little bit, if that's okay. I don't want to take up too much of the time or bandwidth, but I'm just wondering if once that program, the culturing program, can hopefully get refunded and supported, if that's another opportunity for some of the fishermen to extend their time, income from the water, if they could be engaged in that way.
Yeah. I mean, that's I can talk a little bit on it. That's kind of step 8 or step 9, and we're still in the funding processes of step 1 or step 2. We do still go through our state procurement laws. So if we do contract that work out, it will be done competitively. But I certainly do understand that local stakeholders and harvesters do have a wealth of knowledge that I cannot obtain through reading research papers or books or whatnot. So being able to partner with them is certainly a benefit I would see for everyone. So yeah, that is certainly something when we are having those conversations, we do aim to see how we can incorporate those folks as much as possible.
Great question, Vincent. That was one of mine as well. There's a few other questions that have come in offline. One is, at what frequency will monitoring data be collected, and how often will harvesting rules be adopted in response to the current habitat condition?
Yeah, so we do plan to monitor the reefs annually. So we want to be able to adaptively manage this fishery. How I talk about it with some of the stakeholders is it's like a water spigot. You may want to open it at a certain amount, but after a few, not a few years, the next year you may need to bring it back. You may be able to allow a little bit more flow. So being able to adaptively manage it to where it works for the resource and those who utilize the resource is definitely a win-win. So they will be assessed annually. A lot of the information that makes up that framework of how the fishery would be managed relies on having pre-season monitoring. Having those bag tags and having them reef specific, that kind of allows reefs to close on their own. So if there are, I'm just throwing out numbers, if there are 100 Cap Point reef bag tags, once all 100 have been harvested and checked in, we know Cap Point is effectively closed. Law enforcement also knows that that is closed. So if they see someone kind of poking around Cap Point, they may need to go see what's going on over there. So with that, we do understand that a lot of the points that we have in our potential framework would be considered quite conservative, some of those numbers. So I do imagine that in our adaptive management process, we'll certainly want to take a look at some of these details for this commercial fishery to see, to really assess if we can kind of move the needle one way or the other, which for, again, the long-term sustainability of the oysters and those who utilize the oysters.
Thanks, Devin. Question from Steve Durham and then Laura.
Yeah, thanks, Devin. I have a couple questions, but I think I'll start with one. I was wondering if you could go into like a little bit more detail on the process for how you decided which of these sort of options that you presented to present. Like, there's obviously a lot of different ways you could regulate the fishery. I'm just wondering how you narrowed it down, and if it, like, how this process maybe incorporated, you know, findings from like the ABSI work or, you know, other major research initiatives.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so we did want to make sure that we were able to gather feedback, comments, questions, concerns, whether they were positive, negative, or neutral from as many outlets as possible. So yeah, well, one, you know, as I was starting to think about all of those groups, certainly ABSI, the Community Advisory Board, one major deliverable that they came out with was a very large but detailed and informative management recommendation, a suite of different recommendations on a variety of topics pertaining to the management of those of Apalachicola oysters. So that document, the successor group to the Community Advisory Board, the Partnership for Resilient Apalachicola Bay, they provided some of their recommendations on taking what the Community Advisory Board came up with and seeing which ways they may want to slightly pivot off of. So that information, all those public workshops that I discussed, meeting with our internal offices and divisions, whether that's FWI, to understand feasibility of being able to gather important information on what the bay looks like, working with law enforcement as well, even, you know, as our Office of Licensing and Permitting, to understand that, hey, idea XYZ may make so much sense conceptually, but can we put that in the real world to make sure that it would work? So talking internally and also just kind of sitting down with some of the stakeholders one-on-one. That was something that I enjoy doing, is setting up a day where I go down to East Point and Apalachicola and meet with as many folks as I can. Anywhere from someone who used to be a recreational harvester to the chairman of the County of Commissioners and kind of everyone in between to kind of get their feedback as well. We also discussed it with other states. So I referenced that 2013 meeting with all of the Gulf states. We still keep in close contact with many of those folks that were at those meetings, just to kind of understand. For instance, Mississippi, they reopened. So just kind of learning what steps did they take in preparing for reopening, and then what did they learn? Maybe learn the hard way, on how reopening went in Mississippi, and just being able to understand potential pitfalls, hurdles, unforeseen, that we can kind of learn and adapt to. In February, at the commission meeting, we gave an update to our commissioners on everything oysters. A lot of the information that's in this presentation, but also anywhere from the biology, more in-depth restoration research, just kind of everything, hitting all of the points on oysters here in the state, to let them know and kind of prepare them, give them that foundational understanding of the resource. So when we do come back in August and November, they're informed. Some of our commissioners have came out into the bay to kind of see firsthand what the resource looks like. So I think all that information have been all great pieces of the puzzle to bring it together. And then ultimately we come up with what we think is a good idea, and then we go back out externally. And I can tell you that from those meetings that we've had in April, May, and even last week at those workshops, we've been able to see, all right, how can we continue to massage this framework to where everyone may not be happy, but we think it works best for the oysters and the oyster harvesters. And one thing that is really big for us is we want to make sure everyone's informed. They may not be happy about it, but at least they understand what we are going to be bringing in August. I don't want anyone to be surprised when we get in front of the commissioners come August.
All right, thanks. Laura can go. I can ask another question if there's time. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. So has the state done like a cost benefit analysis or some type of economic analysis to better understand, the investment they're putting into this, and what is the return to people of Florida, not only the oyster fishermen, but I'm sure there's a lot of multiplier economic benefits. We also know oysters provide a lot more benefits than just what they do for food for humans. But the state isn't restoring oysters, it doesn't sound like, for ecosystem benefits, only for harvesting benefits. And sort of just trying to get an idea of what the state's read is on that, and has that come up in any of your discussions?
Yeah, it has. Yeah. So this FWC has not come up with, or has not developed a formal cost analysis of the restoration work we've been doing, but it is a point that we've been kind of leveraging the work of external partners to be able to gather some of that data and bring that to leadership and to commissioners. So if an individual is looking at it from a fiscal perspective, a business perspective, and they go, I don't know which way I'm in the screen, but if we're spending this much on restoration for a fishery that's only this much, I don't understand this difference here. So, and while you do look at it just that lens, you are correct. But when you do understand the water quality, the storm erosion reduction, et cetera, it will outweigh some of what initially we look at as potentially unbalanced. So yeah, it's certainly something that we want to continue to drive home in our presentations. And it's something that I think the folks downtown in Tallahassee that are making these budgets, they are understanding of that, because we do see that oysters and items pertaining to restoration of certain areas for oyster reefs continues to be a priority with the legislator. So it's something that we'll continue to suggest and continue to put in our legislative budget requests.
Will this, just a follow-up, will the state ever consider restoring reefs just for the ecosystem service benefits like water quality? Because certainly when you're harvesting a reef, there's a big time lag between when they're actually put on the reef versus, or when they recruit to the reef versus when they're actually, filtering a considerable amount of water. Whereas if you have restored reefs that are not harvestable. Over time, they get bigger and grow and, do a much better job of water clarity in that location. So.
Yes. And to quickly answer, yes, that has been discussed on being able to have some reefs that would not be harvested, that would be there purely for the ecosystem services.
Oh,
One way, I know we're kind of running out of time. One way that we've tried to kind of ride the fence on that is some of the restoration work that we did in Appalachia last year, where rather than using small rock, we used a little bit larger rock. It can still be tongued, it can still be harvested, but it'll be a little bit more difficult. I kind of tell people you may need to go to the gym a few more days out of the week. So with that, we think that will kind of provide that long-lasting habitat for continued recruitment. Now, I do understand what you're saying is as those oysters grow and kind of age, the ecosystem services are certainly more beneficial. But we are hoping that having such large rock will demand that culling is done on site, so that rock isn't culled halfway back to the boat ramp, nor is it left in the oyster bags when they are sold.
Thank you.
Thanks, Devin. I wanted to clarify before we close, is there a final deadline for comments to FWC on these proposed changes to the rule?
I wouldn't say that there is a hard deadline on that. So even though the commission meeting, looking at my schedule here, is August 13th and 14th, the deadline to kind of prep, whether it's the PowerPoint or related supported, documents, are already quickly approaching. So we do have a lot of the framework already developed, but we will certainly continue to not only take public questions and public comments, but digest all that and utilize it when we are looking to see if we do need to move the needle on any of these points. So basically, we will provide this as a proposed rule in August. We'll take feedback that we hear from our commissioners in August. And then in between August and November, we will continue to massage this framework and then ultimately come back first week of November with final rule.
Okay, thank you. And for FORS, if any participants from today's call have follow-up questions, can we compile those? Would you be willing to take a look at any follow-up questions that come in, Devin, and develop something like a short written response if we missed anyone today?
Absolutely.
Okay, there's one from Vincent about is there a basin management action plan for Apalachicola Bay, which I can help follow up on as well. But I would say with that, thank you so much, Devin, for your time. Thanks to everyone for your participation today. We had a great group. I'll send out the meeting recording after the fact. A link to a copy of Devin's slides has already been posted in the chat. It's available on the FORS Dropbox. And please reach out to me, y'all, if folks have any question. Devin provided his contact information as well as Erica's. So thanks, everybody, for a great call today. Have a good afternoon.